Excellent, excellent. We'll go ahead and get started with the topic. Sort of came up in casual conversations over the last few years of how we try to characterize the work that we do, and actually with Brent, who's on my panel, it kind of came up like, we're really kind of changing the cold room mentality, and I want to just take a second to make sure we're kind of all thinking about kind of how we're defining that. And so it actually is a well-made point by the panelists here, is that though, like, we got to be really careful about defining it. So when we had a meeting, we were talking, it was like, so we're thinking when we think cold room mentality, we're thinking about the relational and the operational barriers to creating data infrastructure and accessing and building communities around that data infrastructure. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of put everybody on the same page there. It's like how we're thinking about this. And so I just want to take a moment to introduce the panelists. We have Amy Hahn-Nelson, who's the Director of Training and Technical Assistance at the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. We have Raj Darolia, a Professor of Public Policy at the University of Kentucky. Brent Hewitt, Chief of Structure, Technology, and Productivity at the Resource and Rural Economics Division at USDA. We also have Robert Magoo, who's Chief Data Officer at the State of Arkansas, and Josh Hawley, Director of Ohio Education Research Center. So we just wanted to thank you all for joining us today and taking time. So we'll just get right to it. So I wanted to start with the first question and think, so we've made a lot of progress, and I don't want to, act like we're at ground zero. Everybody in this room has been working hard on building and creating access data infrastructure, and we've made a lot of progress over the last decade in changing the cold room mentality. But from your perspective, what has been critical in involving that culture around infrastructure, data infrastructure, and its access? And Amy, we can start with you if you'd like. And I think the microphone's right there.
Good morning. Is that great? Okay. So I will admit to being the one who got on the planning call and thought we were talking about like a very metaphoric cold room, because that's my world. It's like trying to get people around a table to talk to, sharing, and do the data governance part. And everyone else was like, no, we literally mean like a cold room. Like a disconnected closet where like you gotta check your flash drives like at the door and you can't wear pockets. And I was like, oh, okay. So I reoriented. So I will still say, like, the purpose to me, metaphoric versus literal, is to us at ASP, we think a lot about different types of data sharing and integration being very relational, right? And being very based on the trust. One of the things we often write about and talk about is how data moves at the speed of trust, right? So when we think about a cold room and kind of eliminating that as a barrier, we'd like to just bring that up as, a cold room is a tool, right? Like if you have no trust, if you have no relationships, if you aren't sure who you're sharing with, or that, there isn't a clear established legal authority, if there isn't a purpose that's, in law, as we heard in our previous speaker, then you may need a cold room. And so I think there's a place for that until you build the necessary pieces to then not have one, which I think is the ultimate goal for all of us, right?
Excellent, Raj. Turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to mostly focus on my perspective as a professor and somebody who prioritizes not just doing my own work and helping out some of my partners that I'm helping do with evaluation, but also training the next generation of researchers, and also trying to think about science and data frameworks that help contribute to the public good, mostly from a research perspective. And so, one of the big things that I think is a challenge in some of these relationships have helped overcome is really thinking about sort of bigger problems really demand like multi-dimensional, multi-domain solutions, right? So it's not just thinking about education issues or labor issues or food insecurity. It's really all of these things are really interconnected, and to be able to answer questions related to these things, they also really need to be interconnected as well. The data that we use and the techniques that we use to analyze them. The other thing I'll just mention now, and I'm sure we'll have more time to talk later, is that, as somebody who is trying to train people to use data to go maybe work in state agencies later, work in federal agencies, be researchers themselves, if we don't have ability to safely share data with people who are sort of by construction more likely to make mistakes, who are kind of making their way through this process. It's an investment we want to make. If we have really restricted environments from which they can work, then the cost for me as a PI or lead researcher is incredibly high for bringing in somebody new to work on things, right? And so being able to train people in an environment that has safeguards, certainly, but also has an ability to provide kind of an open structure and transparency, at least in some ways, I think is really critical. And then the last piece I'll just mention with this, which is more just about data infrastructure, is everything that I try to do, whether it's my research team or myself, we want it to be able to be reproduced, right? And that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different settings. But if we think about things like open science frameworks or making our code and data available, these are all principles that I certainly believe in. And the more we restrict spaces to just a limited number of people, the less able we are to do this, both in spirit and in practical terms. So I'll turn it over there and we'll talk more later.
Great, thanks. So I guess I want to elaborate a little bit on my perspective coming to this topic, which is yes, somebody at USDA in a statistical agency, one at USDA. I'm with the Economic Research Service. We have a sister agency at USDA, the National Agricultural Statistical Service, with two principal statistical agencies at USDA. I've been there only 2 years, though, so my perspective is partly coming from work we do at USDA, but also as a professor for 15 years at UW-Madison, where I was involved in getting started their Federal Statistical Research Data Center location on campus there. And that was the outgrowth, really, of research that I was doing where I wanted to use data in that system. We didn't have a center on campus, and I started my work with those data at the Chicago RDC, and came back after my first visit thinking this is not going to be viable as a long run project for me to go back and forth between Chicago and Madison, and so I came back. Ended up getting involved in starting the RDC there at Madison. And I guess for me, that is, if you think about critical, the question was, what are we doing to break down the culture around the cold room? The presence of those locations, of those RDCs, was one step. Putting data out, taking data out into the states, into remote enclaves, bringing it closer to researchers, allowing broader access to the data, and to the same data, right? So everybody's actually in a remote location working on data that's at a centralized facility, working on the same data, and so it's not the idea of the cold room that I haven't, had experience with Madison, was actually data going out on flash drives, on CDs, actually, to specific computers, and every individual research project is an isolated project in an isolated space, working with isolated data, and there's no real opportunity for collaboration and for a two-way flow of data use and potential improvement of the data with researchers, working actively on the same data that maybe even the data producers, are working on in a shared data storage, location. And so when you get to this setting where there's a common data storage location, multiple kinds of uses of the data and production of the data, you're outside the cold room space, or the specific cold room structure. But in my experience in the RDC, it felt like I was still in a cold room, because the data and projects were still isolated. There was very little collaboration across research teams and use of the data. No sharing of code, no limited ability to generate kind of reproducible workflows that were mentioned, and very little sort of potential for back and forth. In the particular research project that I was working on, we were discovering things in the data that we wanted to feed back to the production of the data, because there were problems. There were data quality problems, data opportunities, or opportunities to enhance the data. We wanted to be able to feed back into the production side of the data. and there was this still kind of a mentality of you're remote, your project is isolated, and still feeling like you're in a cold room, even though you're in a hot space, feasibly. So that's kind of the perspective I came to USDA with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm to be in a position where I could have some amount of potentially influence over the administration of our microdata at USDA, and try to build the kind of infrastructure that I thought would support a more to improve access, improve research workflows, and have more of a two-way street between researchers and data producers. And that's the work I've been doing with that Nate referenced with Coleridge. And as you probably none of you would be surprised to learn that my experience so far in a couple of years of trying to really push things forward on that agenda, it's slow going. And it's a process, that's going to take time for us to achieve, to advance. But it's advancing. It's advancing, and we are making progress. And I'm really excited about what's possible given the new technology capabilities that are available.
Robert, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Is this working?
Yep, I think so. I'm hearing you here, so
Okay.
it's
All
hard
right.
for me to tell if it's on.
From a state perspective, and mirroring many of your comments, but we're in day-to-day contact with those who are serving the citizens directly and very cognizant of operational needs and citizens facing like pending policy changes and benefits cliffs, and really where the rubber meets the road, trying to use the data for both evidence-based policy and operational impact. So 3 key things for us that we can do with the secure cloud-based enclave, but we couldn't do with cold rooms, are building interest to kind of encourage data sharing through delivering actionable products of value, building capacity through a training community of practice, and that community of practice across agencies and states has been huge. And in many cases, we had some cold rooms, but they were silos of their own. We didn't always have a cold room environment. So, having something where there was nothing before, and I can illustrate this a little bit more of a story of just our past 3 years. In spring of 2019, we had legislation passed giving us responsibility as the CDO office to establish a unified longitudinal data system for the state. And so December 2019, I went to a SHIO conference. Julia Lane was there talking about the ADRF and the Coleridge initiative. And we were new to this. It's been a long way in a short time. So we signed up for the spring 2020 Coleridge class in Ohio, and immediately we're just plugged into this wonderful community of practice, and we're able to learn so much and test it out, not with our own Arkansas data, but with Ohio and Illinois data, and do a project on nursing pipelines, which we're actually now able to take back and apply on Arkansas data now that it's policy relevant for us. We followed that up with starting to get into the ADRF, getting into an ETA-sponsored class on unemployment to reemployment. Again, we're working with Illinois data, with an Illinois-developed model that we were able to take and leverage to better understand our own unemployment, but also to start building on that. We did a project to kind of start looking at exhaustion risk, and now the ADRF is allowing co-innovation for 3 states working together simultaneously to co-develop enhancements to that portal that will then be available to other states. And we hope it's not only a value to other states, but we want those states to add their own innovations that then we and everyone else can benefit from. So that kind of collaboration just wouldn't really be possible in a cold room environment. We've subsequently worked with NGA on scaling work-based learning in Arkansas, and that was a very nascent space. It surfaced a lot of questions on our learning agenda that we had no way to really answer. And the ADRF allowed us to very quickly pull together a community of practice, get the data into a secure space, facilitate research, and start developing actionable products that they can use to really understand and communicate the value of work-based learning to employers, to citizens, to policymakers, to drive things from the policy level all the way down to operational. And we've got a number of classes coming up looking at WIOA, SNAP, TANF, and other things. And we always invite others from other states in, and it's really changing our state's data culture, kind of like always mixing on the teams between agencies, between data experts, policy experts, coders, and always usually having 4 or 5 different states in the same class. So that would not be possible in a cold room. I can't imagine any way we would have come this far in 3 years without having the secure data enclave.
Sure. Josh?
Thanks, Nate and panelists. So in thinking about how to answer this, I had a bunch of notes written down, but then in reacting to what my panelists have said, I think what I want to add is that what I've learned about improving access to data is mostly about relationships, which sounds funny. It's less about the technical side of things, because a lot of that is fairly obvious. You have to build a cloud-based system, something that's not stuck in one place. You got to open it up so that you can have ready access to it, and you can blend, as our keynote speaker talked about. Share code. I can learn from each other. But I think fundamentally what I've learned and what I've told some other people in the audience when they've asked me is that you have to be willing to devote time and develop relationships with the people who are the data owners and work in the governance process. And so I don't know what happened, but like 25 years ago I started doing that. And I don't think it was very intentional at the beginning and when I started in Florida or when I moved to Ohio. But it became intentional in about 2006 or so. And ever since that time, I think the relationships are the most important thing to ensure that we break down the cold room mentality. And it has demonstrable benefits in terms of the questions that we can ask. Because I think what motivates all of the people who have access to data and need to use data to make positive decisions to improve either citizens or customers, in the case of, is the question, And then the last thing I'll say is that when you break down that cold room and you have access to better data, the questions just flow out. I mean, it's astonishing to me the amount of creativity that's inside state government. If we can break down and give people access to critical data resources to enable them to go beyond the minutia of performance reporting or their siloed program. So I'm really excited about it, but I don't think it's as much to me about technology as it is about human nature and breaking that down.
Thanks. That's actually a really good segue into the next question, so it's perfect. So, I mean, we have, what I said, we have 26 states represented. So we have 26 states here today, probably in 26 different places with their progress, the agents they have involved, the systems they have in place. And so, in thinking and following up with your comments, Josh, and thinking about that is, what advice would you give to other states to break down these data silos, these relationship silos that sometimes create the data silos, and barriers to access? So what advice would you give them to breaking that down? And Raj, we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks. So, as a researcher, I definitely heavily rely on my data partners. I'm very fortunate in Kentucky to have a really awesome set of partners. I see Angie Tambari back there and Jessica Cunningham, who has since departed us, at least in title, from Kentucky as well. But that relationship, I think, is critically important. For me, it's not just about, as a researcher coming and saying, hey, I have all these questions that I want answered, please give me your data. I try to really approach it as like a collaborative exercise to say, these are some things I'm hearing, maybe from a national perspective or from some other states that I've been talking to. What are you seeing as well? And to me, one of the big things I tell my students, or I try to do myself as well, is the first time you meet somebody, the first couple times you meet somebody, when you're developing that relationship, there should never be an ask in there. There should never be like, hey, I need this thing from you, or hey, you need this thing from me. It's really just about trying to understand each other's, kind of collective or universal pain points, right? Like, we both want this question answered. How can we help each other do that? And so I think that relationship point is incredibly important. And then I would say, like, getting to know people and what they are, it's kind of keeping them up at night, or what is they're really struggling to answer within the capacity that they have in their own organization, I think just leads to a lot of really mutually beneficial relationships. So as a professor, I can bring incredibly cheap labor to a lot of these problems, right? So there's, students who are like literally going to pay to work on your project. So that is something that I think is really important. And then, what I try to sell to them too, and I think this is true, and we're starting to see some of this, is then, these are your future employers, these are, internship providers, getting these skills as well. And obviously, my data providers have a lot of data access and just kind of incredible content knowledge as well. So I think the relationship piece is incredibly important, but I would say, don't move too fast in that relationship, right? Like, let the kind of problems come up organically. Jess and I started to get to know each other, and Angie, during the pandemic, and we used to have sort of like glasses of wine spread out in somebody's backyard, talking some about sort of problems that were going on in the state and some data sources, but also just kind of catching up on how it was to, homeschool your child for 2 years during the pandemic. So, I think that just develops some trust. And also, again, like if we're kind of talking a little more openly about some of the challenges that we're facing operationally, from a policy perspective, from a data perspective, I think we just have come to, it allowed us to kind of develop just a richer, deeper set of questions that we want to collectively answer.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. Brent?
Yeah, so I guess I'm an outlier in the group here, in the sense that we don't have the kinds of shared agreements with states to work with them and their data, but we do have relationships with each of our states through the institution that Julia Lane mentioned in her talk, the Agricultural Extension Service, and the Hatch Act that funds that program as a shared partnership between states, the federal government, and actually counties. It goes down to the county level. And so I will add to this conversation by saying that that's actually something that we're thinking about, sort of trying to reimagine and reinvigorate and see as a potential opportunity, based on the historical legacy of having the relationship with states and counties. We had a particular kinds of activities that we engaged in with them that were appropriate to the time, at the development of those institutions. Those institutions have, the needs and opportunities have changed over time. One way to respond to those changes, I think, is in this realm of data assets and data governance, and building on those partnerships to think of creative ways to engage on accessing new kinds of data, to complement and augment our traditional surveys that we do for data that speaks to the sector, and that's going to be critically important to us moving forward. Relationships, building on existing relationships, and thinking of creative ways to build data partnerships and to build cooperation and real value exchange in terms of what we're providing back on sector or regional level reporting capacity, and what they're able to provide to us in terms of the data and building trust that was spoken to earlier around the collection and administration and use of those data.
Excellent. Thanks, Brent. Robert?
And I'll mirror and kind of double down on some of the other comments. I think a lot of it's kind of facilitating understanding of the risk-utility trade-off and having that trust and comfort. So that risk-utility trade-off, I know when we started, there was a lot of real or perceived cost or risk to sharing data, not a lot of perceived benefit or value. So we had to kind of work on both sides to kind of do small things with maybe non-sensitive data at first, something that fits in the comfort zone to kind of demonstrate the value and start, getting different partners engaged and coming up with their own ideas and seeing, the ROI for their perspective and how it's going to benefit their populations or benefit their programs. And then education on the risk side, because in many cases there was kind of an all or nothing mindset to sharing data previously, and there was no previous education on tiered access or all of the different types of privacy preserving controls or disclosure review. So just helping them understand that. And that's one thing that having the training facility helped to where maybe they could come to a class, not actually have their own data in, work on another agency or another state's data, and see firsthand the way that the governance is enforced and the way privacy is preserved, and kind of come to it in their own time when that value proposition flips for them. So always coming from empathy, from in their minds, kind of like what's that risk, what's that comfort level. We were given the option to have legislation requiring data sharing, and opted to not do that because I wanted to kind of let everyone come at their own comfort level. I think that's worked out like very, very well. And so I think the education and the community of practice and just seeing what other states are doing is very helpful. And sometimes even just bringing their federal partners to the table. Like we've had discussions with DOL and FNS when starting to share different bits of data to really help our stakeholders understand from the federally cognizant agencies what the regulations really mean and what are the compliant ways to share data for what purposes, and to understand how other states are doing it and how their federally cognizant agencies would prefer that data to be shared.
Excellent. Thanks, Robert. Josh?
It's hard for me to answer this one. I think time, plan on 10, 15 years on a particular project. I've had to wait, you laugh, and I'm seeing Dan here, but I've had to wait as long as 7 or 8 years for a file. And this goes before JFS, this is not JFS. And that's, and so you just have to have the patience to have long-term goals and have the funding, system in place that is possible. I think the other thing I might say is, and I hesitate to say this, I say something that you shouldn't do rather than you should. I know we're all trying to be positive here right now. But, you should try not to reduplicate something in whatever jurisdiction you're looking on or organization you're looking on. You should try to work from within if possible. And so, I've tried to do that and to partner with people rather than seeing them as competitors. And I think that's a really a hard thing to do when you're motivated, we're intrinsically motivated by success and economic gain, and that's just a reality about human beings. But cooperation is probably a better way for getting things done in the long run in data, at least. I'll stop.
Okay. Excellent. Amy?
This is all I think about, so I could answer this particular question for hours, but I will try to constrain myself. I also have a lot of metaphors rolling around in my head. I feel like that could just complicate, because we've already got a complicated metaphors I've described going on. So I just want to put a couple exclamation points, because I agree with everything the rest of the panel has said. And I would particularly like to point out one that I feel like just isn't talked about enough, that Josh just mentioned around the duplication. So at AISP, we do a lot of all of our work is field building for for data integration and data sharing work. And we cannot tell you the number of times we've got an inquiry from someone, to like, yeah, we want to start this data integration thing, and we're like, hey, you should walk down the hallway. There's this thing that already exists, and they're in a different agency, but we think they're in the same building because we have their mailing address. I am not kidding you. happens all the time, in different places, cities, counties, states. There is data integration going on everywhere, at every level of government. So that is where we always encourage people to start, is some kind of data landscaping work. Like, please look around, take your head up out of your office, out of your cold room, if that's where you're stuck, and like look around, because there's probably some really interesting data integration happening near you. It may not be the exact same thing, but it could be repurposed or reused, or you could have shared staff, or there are ways to do this in a collaborative way. So that's one big one. The other one is to think really carefully around where you're trying to cite this effort. There are, as we all know, there are real legal restrictions around these data, especially as we are making our data landscapes more complex, right? When we're talking about blending and the private and the nonprofit data and the federally protected sources, and then you have state statute and rule that layers on top of that, that's like a whole nother ballgame in some states. Some states just have like really complicated legal landscapes. So thinking about those pieces, it's really helpful to think critically around where you're citing it. So like if you know your use case involves really challenging data to share, then think about citing your data integration in the agency that owns that data. Because that will prevent you the 10 years, right? You don't have to cite everything there, but like if you can make it in a way that the data never leaves, that just makes the legality of it easier. Again, you can use a technical tool to look at the data, but legally cite it somewhere. So that will prevent a lot of headaches and prevent this, lag of data sharing that we're seeing. I too have waited 7 years. I too have waited for just a lawyer to retire. Has anyone else done that? Anyone else checked LinkedIn regularly? No one? No one? Okay. I know y'all are lying. I know y'all do this too. Okay. So see, a lot of y'all check LinkedIn for certain staff roles, don't you? So the other thing I'll say, this is something that we've learned, especially the state level, is to lead with a use case. So no one wants to put their data in a data mausoleum. Just none of us want to do that. And none of us want to be the director of a data mausoleum, right? So if you lead with the use case, that way the data is of high enough interest to flow into this thing you're creating. So rather than leading with a technical solution or a data system, right, we want to lead with a problem and then have the data follow it. And then the last thing I'll say is just a plug for process. We are all here because we believe deeply that there is power of data to do good, right? That means, like, by definition, we're kind of all pretty outcome oriented. But the process here is what makes the magic, and I think all the panelists have said that, right? It's go slow, it's tread lightly, it's bring people all the ways to say this, right? To build the relationships. But that process, if you are committed to the process, that will ensure that you're never going too fast, you're never being too slow, that you are keeping everyone's commitments and goals in mind as you're doing the work.
Can I just piggyback on something that was just said? And it's about the duplication and replication, maybe from a different angle. And so as a user of data, we see this a lot too, and in that, I'll give an example, and I won't name the state, but I'm helping a state do an evaluation for some of their data. And I'm using a remote access to it, but everybody has their own separate workspaces, and we're not allowed to share anything across those workspaces, which is fine. I understand that there's privacy restrictions for that, but just the data cleaning process is going to take us over a year probably to do. And there are other teams that are not asking the exact same question, but a similar question, who have already been a couple years ahead of us. And they are legally restricted, or at least that's the interpretation, of sharing basic code of how to clean certain areas, nothing with the data itself. And so I would encourage you, if you are managing data systems, I know there are restrictions on sharing data, but making basic code available on how to clean the data, how to get it to an analytic data set, what are some problems we know that this provider just had a lot of missings in this year, or something else. That sort of documentation, to me, should not be something as a researcher that I should try to protect. nor should it be something that I think legally we should, we can kind of sanitize that in a way that is not really revealing anything. And that would go, at least from a user's perspective, it would allow researchers to kind of start at a point well down the road than often we have to start right now, which is every team is basically going through the same painful process over and over and over again. And states are paying for this, funders are paying for this, and so it's a hugely inefficient use of our time as well.
Yep, please.
To piggyback, build that into your legal agreements. So you can have a section of your legal agreements that is like for use and then for data management, data quality purposes. They are two separate things. They should be handled different legally. That is fair game under most state statutes. You're already doing it because most of us have centralized IT at the state level. You already have authorizing authority for this in most places. But if you build it into your agreements, that data quality work is fair game and it's legal. You're not like tricking anyone, like you've built it in on purpose. So I just can't say it enough. Like, please, don't just put the use into your legal agreements because we're going to go nowhere unless we improve the data quality of these data.
It's a great point.
I'll add, there's been, and it is here, a lot of discussion about integrating state and agency and statistical system data. Bob Groves mentioned also proprietary data, and I want to emphasize that as a potential growth opportunity or need for the future. In the domain that I work, I think we administer roughly a 2.5, 3 hour in-person survey to a fairly large sample across the entire country. I think if we go through, though, I haven't actually done this exercise, but I was just thinking if I went through the survey instrument that I could probably identify a digital source of the data, the data that's being asked of the respondent somewhere pretty much for every question, if not every question. And so, we're going to get at some of that data in the future through administrative partners. There's going to be some remaining questions that we're going to need to ask respondents. A huge chunk of the data is in proprietary data silos or data storage locations. And I think one of the opportunities for the future and real needs for the future, and I know Aho has some experience with this, and I'll maybe be looking to her for help, is building creative partnerships and where there's mutual benefit, with proprietary actors who are interacting, in our case, with farmers, but they could be interacting with, students or households in whatever context, to find ways to provide value to them through our unique role as federal statistical agencies. And the ability to report, on national level activities, to be able to blend data and to integrate other kinds of data with their data to provide back aggregate reporting that's valuable to them, and to provide the trust and the data and research computing infrastructure to provide confidence and security and trust, and that their data will be protected and used well. So that's a huge area, I think, for the future that we need to look to. And then another area that maybe a little bit more present and immediate is this cheap labor idea. I like that. I like that possibility. And in fact, it's something I've thought about a lot. With our data asset and the notion of blending and linking data, is that in the prior epochs of graduate student research in social science, a lot of students would do surveys themselves, go out and do surveys and collect primary data. I think now and in the future, a lot of what's being done is some form of blending or data linking and data wrangling, feature construction, classification, various kinds of pre-processing of data to construct research frames that are useful to answer a specific question. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to engage with academic partners to provide access to our data assets, even pre-processed, pre-public release, at the stage where graduate students, some of their research can be constructing data, research data out of the sort of primary and other data that we collect. And one of the things that maybe would help move that forward is finding ways to give more credit for data production, data creative construction of data product, essentially, or some kind of value contribution, some kind of data quality improvement as part of the research process. And I think they're developing formal mechanisms with DOIs and so on for even code that's used to process the data potentially. That could be added to the portfolio of graduate student output during their thesis.
And I primarily see kind of two areas that I'm most interested in seeing improvement going forward, and they're both a little bit under the covers to just help with the value proposition and help things go a little bit faster and more efficiently. One is just building a consistent interoperable foundation, because all the things we've been talking about, like we're all talking about the same logical data, but there are differences in semantics in the structure of the data or the way things are encoded, and we spend a lot of time on that on different projects. But to really get the full value proposition very quickly and get these cycles going faster, one thing that we can do with the secure data enclave we couldn't really do if we're running each of our cold rooms, things like that, is to work across state lines to develop standard data models, standard reference data codes, developing that semantic consistency from the front end. That's going to make these products scalable much faster, make innovation go much faster. There's already been some efforts that Josh worked on a model. New Jersey's doing work, but I think there's a lot more to do. And it's better to do it now to build that interoperable foundation before we do more work, because that's going to lift all boats. The other, as we're starting to do more and more product development, is really kind of, and it's a good problem to have. Now we need to think more about maturing our change management, because we can have multiple states all co-developing on the same product at the same time. And we need to make sure we're not branching off and making a mess, but we're kind of building a way to rapidly be integrating those changes, managing, versioning those changes, and making sure that states have easy access to pull from this growing repository of products that are really kind of the value proposition that can help change that cold room mentality. And I guess a third one would kind of be starting to think beyond just our traditional administrative data that we're working with and we've been traditionally had in a cold room, and leveraging some of the advantages of cloud with more timely or external data from public-private data trust with employers. Or I think there's a lot of potential in the emerging LER landscape to get context that we don't normally have from our traditional administrative data.
So I'm going to give you some things to write down. These are things I think that everybody needs to worry about in our opportunities. One is linkage processes across files. We can always get better at that, and I think getting better at that seems like an achievable challenge. We still lag behind industry in things like identity management or patching, updating programs when things are in the cloud. It's really stressful having to try to update a Tableau instance when you're using a different instance in somewhere else, and that stuff should just get easier. Data catalogs to me feel a bit like alchemy. I think they're really important, but I don't think maybe that's a place where AI can play more of a role rather than relying on all this searches that people do. I've learned a lot recently from working with the ILO on concepts like decent work and having really good code that is shared across the ILO on measurement of concepts like decent work makes survey analysis in individual countries really a breeze. Longitudinal data systems are still not there in every state. I am so envious of Kentucky, my friends from Kentucky still, because they have, to me, a really nice operation and a nice legislative framework. And one of the most important things is they have some central funding. Finally, I think we're not really there on cooperative agreements across agencies to handle what I would call edge cases. I'm thinking about foster care youth, or one I'm working on now is adult maltreatment, or maternal mortality, which I've worked on in the past. These are data edge cases that existing agreements don't really ever cover, and how we can get better at doing those quickly rather than relying on these purpose-built legal agreements that are just tedious. and expire before you actually, get results. So those are just a list of things that were percolating in my head about things to look at.
I think we just managed to skip to the next question, so if you want to go ahead. Yeah. You good? Raj, do you have anything? This was about the areas of growth that still need attention, but I think we just kind of blended through that for the last question, so worked out perfectly. So,
I mean, I can
great.
put mine.
If you'd like, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So I'm just going to say it again. Please figure out your data governance and legal frameworks first. Thank you.
All right, so we do have a question from the audience, and I think this has come up, and it's a common theme around. It's like, what's the sort of the use case? It's very important, the value proposition, essentially. And the question is basically, it's like, how do we prevent that use case from being a one-off? And I think the intention here is like, how do we start to institutionalize all of the things that had to happen to make that use case happen? So how do we kind of keep from that being sort of a one-off activity? Amy, we can start with you if you'd like.
So our guidance, especially at the state level, is to start with a use case because it's easiest for agencies to come up with questions that they will push over the finish line. Almost every executive leader in a state agency has a question that they want answered that they cannot get answered. We once had a very large state in our TA program that they called it Mike's problem. Literally, the entire TA effort was based on answering Mike's question and Mike's problem. And I'm not kidding. And they did it, and they did an amazing job, and it is a model for all of us. But leading with that use case, that immediately gives you resources, it gives you executive leadership, it gives you access. It makes an executive leader tell their legal counsel to respond to your emails, which is really important and critical, as we established earlier. So leading with that use case is really important, and then you can go from there, right? When we see efforts nationally really struggle, it's when they lead with something else. It's when they lead with legislation. I completely agree with you. Please don't put strong legislation in, because we're not going to write it right, and it's going to create problems for you. There's a place for legislation, but it has to be really carefully crafted, usually after there's already some existing infrastructure in place. So being really careful about those carrots and sticks, but focusing really on the carrots at the beginning, so you don't really ever need the sticks, is our guidance.
So I have a couple ideas on this. One is to, when you're thinking about the research project or the end project, I think there's two things you can do in this. One is to be sort of intentional at the start about what's the public good that comes out of this, right? And so it's not just, hey, what's this report or table or dashboard we're going to create, but what is the data infrastructure that we're going to create, or the proof of concept on a data sharing agreement or a relationship among agencies. Be intentional about that. The other thing I try to do in some of these, we call it, with one of the people I work with, there's some projects you just want to put points on the board, right? Like any kind of points, any sort of positive movement, you want to put points on the board, and then you can kind of snowball from there. But even for those projects, we try to be intentional. What's that little thing? It's not the main thing of the project that we're going to highlight. What's that little thing that we kind of hold back and say, hey, did you really like this? We have the data already to do this other thing, right? And we're intentional about that at the beginning, so that, if people, like the consumers, whether that's a policymaker or whoever that is really excited about it, you're ready at that point to say, oh, and we can do this other thing right now, and with more investment, we can do these other things too. So being intentional at design for some of those, I think, is really important. The other thing I'll say is that, certainly, I think working with academic researchers is a great idea. I would love to work with all of you, so please give me a call after the session. But I do think, people in my academic community, we tend to like to talk to other academics. I'm sure this is sort of true. You can kind of have a common language. It can be very insular at times. But if you're working with academics, especially, or other types of researchers who are often, have professional incentives to be very insular in their communities and their outreach require some sort of public outreach, right? And so whether that's public data products, public, more public-facing briefs, policymaker focused, briefs or reports or other things, I think that's a really important thing to do as well. I mean, one of the things that I see a lot as a researcher and as a professor is that I go into a lot of relationships and say, well, we did this with these other people and we never saw the report. We know it was published, but in some journal that was paywalled and we couldn't understand it because it was written in Greek. And so, sort of building that in at the relationship setting, like kind of the intention, like, hey, go off and publish in some journal that no one will ever read it, but also this is your responsibility, and especially if we're talking about public data here, this is your responsibility to also produce something that can be more accessible for a greater number of people.
Yeah, I don't think I don't have experience building a partnership in my time at USDA yet. So I'm piggybacking on partnerships that have been built in the past. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to provide from our experience on this topic. But I will say, just from my own experience professionally thus far in my career, and thinking about the problem we all have in building new data assets and building new capacity to do good statistics, that it seems to me that there's a huge opportunity around the notion of communities, data communities, and that this is a way to create long-run buy-in, is to make sure that when you're building a data asset, and this is the way I'm thinking towards the future, is that we want to not just push out a data product that's going to be used by academics and other researchers. We want to build a community around a data product and around a set of data assets. And we want to have not just data users, but data contributors. And a bit thinking, off of what I've seen of the open source community and software development, that a lot of the tooling and a lot of the workflows and the mindset that they have around developing software in those communities is a community orientation. And that a lot of the problems, a lot of the work that they do just conceptually is very similar to the work that we do in building data product. It's, it's developing code around, that solves a problem. In our case, it's building data assets, providing more opportunity to have community members around a data asset contribute back to the data, and to have a kind of a shared sense of a common good that we're building together. Is a way to make sure that it's not a one-off.
Excellent. Thank you.
And for many years, I've always tried to kind of work under a think big, start small, move fast mindset, and so we apply that here too. And so we're thinking big, and we're trying to plot our course towards causal evidence with good coverage and low latency, but we're not there yet. Certainly not in every domain. So we're kind of baby stepping along each pathway, but we had to find that kind of what's that. What are those first steps that are really providing value to those that we need to engage and partner with? And so one example of a recent success story that might be helpful for many states is this was the first year that Arkansas training providers had to report on all individuals to ETA, and that they freaked out. But it became an opportunity because it's a very natural fit for something that statewide longitudinal data systems can really support. It's allowable to get better coverage. It's an allowable use for Swiss, and it's that outcomes reporting is exactly the type of thing that administrative longitudinal data systems are geared to do. So it's a value proposition for all of our universities and colleges. It was a value proposition for workforce services. In order to do that, it took a lot of lift off of them and drove actionable data quality improvements to get things to really match up to do that. They had to really improve the quality and consistency of the data on the eligible training provider list. They made a lot of corrections to the actual higher education data that gets used for many, many things. And it really kind of made it drove awareness and engagement, excitement about longitudinal data analysis sharing data, integrating data, and using linked longitudinal data across all of our 2- and 4-year universities.
Thanks, Robert. Josh, you good? Excellent. Well, Robert, since you're still on the mic, we do have a question that's specific for you, if that's okay. So we had a question that wanted just a little bit context around sharing your work based on the work-based learning project, the scope, and how you got partners engaged for that.
And I would have to give credit to NGA for starting the interest in that, because NGA runs a policy academy on scaling work-based learning. And so participants from many Arkansas agencies, training providers, chambers of commerce, employers kind of participated in that to just learn around the value of work-based learning. We had a 4-hour conversation to define work-based learning. And to really start kind of surfacing our questions of value about work-based learning, particularly different nuances of retention, where we have work-based learning. Was work-based learning really aligned with the different kind of industry needs? Again, it's such a nascent space. We're not anywhere near where we are with other forms of education, with doing supply-demand mapping and alignment of programs. So it was exciting because we knew so little. So we had to figure out things very, very quickly, including how to link the Rapids data set to different outcomes, and merging Rapids with career and technical education or higher education, or different forms of work-based learning. And one thing I will point out there is the Rapids data set is available for 49 states. And so it's a pattern that's readily scalable to other states. And it was very, very interesting, because a lot of these questions that had never really, to our knowledge, been asked or answered before. So we had 5 projects that all kind of delivered a lot of answers. One of our teams did what we think is the first shiny dashboard in the ADRF, which is inspiring some other things. Like any good project, for every question they answered, they surfaced 5 new questions. So we're hoping to continue that on. But we were able to, in this case, they weren't science projects. We had a diverse group of cross-sector stakeholders do a design thinking workshop and come up with what are the questions, what would be the products of value. And so that way we were able to give to the class participants, if you answer these questions, it will be of actionable value to the state. And then on the other end of that, now we're not doing all 5 at once. We meet monthly, and we're doing it one at a time, but we're presenting back all those results from each project to the stakeholders to kind of talk about okay, what next? How do we mature this? How do we implement this? What do we want to ask next time?
Excellent. Thanks. Rush. Yeah.
When Robert was talking, it made me think of something that all the federal agencies are required to have now, that I do think is a great idea at a state level, and I haven't seen it as much, but every federal agency, for the most part, has to create what's called a learning agenda, and there are a set of issues that they want to learn about, and I think it's used to different degrees in different agencies, but the idea is then for people, for the community to say, I would like to try to, this is a priority for us to learn about, and to basically offer help in some way or another. But it sounds like in some ways this could be done at a state level as well, to say here are some issues that we want to learn about, and that might be a way to generate more outside interest and some sort of proposals from other folks that you might not know as well.
I will add to that the benefit of the learning agenda approach is, even if we don't have the data, if we don't have the statistical capacity, we want to know that the questions. So we and by kind of grouping, having that list of all the different questions, we can start to see patterns of, okay, these 12 questions are actually the same, so we can do one thing here and answer 12 questions at once. Or by doing the data source and realizing if we just had this one data asset, that would answer a whole bunch of questions. So it really helps, instead of doing one-by-one types of things, finding the best effective use for our resource to bring in one data set, or build kind of one reusable analysis product that meets a whole lot of needs. Or it could be an existing product that if we just added that one more field and just disaggregated by this, or in many cases, the product already exists, and people just don't know, and we just have to point them to it. And the deltas just keep getting smaller. So I'm a huge advocate for kind of like building that in parallel, both that kind of data asset inventory that we talked about, and the learning agenda, and then we can kind of match make in the middle when the culture's right, when the data's available, sometimes when the funding's there. But it's hard to be responsive to these needs when you don't already have that foundational work laid out.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we are right at time, so please join me in thanking the panelists for their experience. Thank you all very much. Much appreciated. I will say we are going to move right to the next session, so if you don't need to get up, just we're going to keep it moving. So, but thank you all again. And everybody gets up there.